Sometimes people will encounter the content on my channel because I'll put something out there that is of interest to them and not necessarily explicitly Catholic in its title or its content. It might be about a historical event or something in the popular culture that piques their interest and is part of the array of their interests. And so they will watch it and they will discover my channel for the first time. And they will often eventually come to the fact that I am a Catholic convert who spends a lot of time on my channel defending the Catholic faith and the Catholic creed and even the Catholic Church. And they will often produce some sort of feedback, either in the comments or otherwise, sometimes through email messages, to the effect of this question, which is, how can you be Catholic? How can you defend the Catholic Church, this horrible institution with its legacy of atrocity and transgression against good people, innocent people? And to be honest, that's a question I sympathize with. It's a question I have to revisit often in my own experience of living the Catholic faith and identifying as a Catholic, especially when some new scandal or some new headline erupts and becomes part of the popular conversation and narrative that casts the Catholic Church in a very unflattering light and with very little to no sympathy. And it's times like that where I have to revisit the question myself and say, why am I doing this? Why am I affiliated with these people who are accused of such horrible things, whether they be peers in the position that I find myself within the church, that is the laity, or even leaders, bishops, and clergy, and even the Pope himself? Why do I subscribe to this doctrine and this community of people who also subscribe to it when there is so much to be ashamed of? And to be honest, it's a natural question to ask. It's the kind of question that I often ask when I discover that certain people are affiliated with other communities or philosophies that I would cast in the same kind of light and say, boy, how can you believe that, knowing the history of thought surrounding that, the origins, and the kinds of things that have been done in the name of that philosophy or that community? So I think it's a natural thing to answer that question, and as a result, I welcome it, and I want to take the opportunity to do whatever I can, as concisely as I can in a single sit-down, to try to explain why it is that I believe the Catholic creed, why it is that I identify as a Catholic, and why it is that I even defend that creed in the church itself. And I will admit, that's an ambitious thing to try to do, and I will do my best in the short time I have available here. As I said, I think it's an ambitious thing to do, and I will only be able to give a superficial or cursory examination of some of the topics that I'll be addressing in this conversation. But on the whole, that's what my channel is about, is really answering this question. And so some of these topics are addressed in much broader and more nuanced length and treatment on my channel. And as we go, I will try to link them in the description, as well as the little pop-ups and things that happen on YouTube, to try to direct you towards some of those more in-depth commentaries. So when people eventually do arrive at that question, how can you be Catholic? It is often accompanied with some sort of an accusation of the church. So how can you be Catholic given, the sex abuse scandals or the Crusades or the Inquisition or this history of imposing unfairly this faith upon innocent people? And in order to make those kinds of accusations, you have to have an accurate understanding of what the church is. And I often find that when people do make those accusations, they are betraying a lack of understanding of what the church really is. They're thinking of the church in terms of it being some sort of global, highly integrated institution, such that, if something happens in Perth, Australia with the Catholic Church, like a school or a parish or a diocese in a locale like that, maybe a scandal erupts. When something like that happens there, then the Catholic Church and all of its various institutions and everything that carries the name of Catholic in a place like Munich, Germany, is just as guilty by association of the things that happen in Perth, Australia. And that's just not an accurate understanding of what the church is. Yes, the church operates institutions, but the common denominator of all of these different groups, communities, ethnicities, and institutions that we call Catholic is a creed of belief. That is what we associate with. That is what provides that principle of unity and identity among all these vast geographies and peoples and ethnicities and races and nations and communities that all call themselves Catholic. And while certain members or groups or even institutions can systematically within that association and that community commit grave evils as well as great goods to humanity, it's not fair to say that everybody who is associated with that creed and identifies with those other people through the common denominator of that creed are likewise guilty of the same thing. For example, I just read this morning about a teacher in the public school system in the community that I live in, which is a small sort of suburban city attached to a larger metropolitan city. So this smaller city, not a lot of crimes, not a lot of headlines occur here that are really worthy of taking note. But even within this small community, a teacher has recently been accused of sexually abusing some of his students, and as well as distributing child pornography, and I think even including some of his students in the production of child pornography. Now, a scandal like that is worthy of note, but nowhere in the article that I was reading about were there any accusations or implied condemnations of the public school system that he was employed at, or even the idea of education as an institution in general. And that's for good reason. People are able to make the distinction between the failures of an individual to uphold the great ambitions of the enterprise of education, as well as that public education system and division. Yet if a clergyman or a bishop or somebody else who represents the Catholic Church in a prominent way is accused of some similar crime, we don't tend to make those kinds of distinctions. We see that as a crime of the Catholic Church, and therefore anytime we want to talk about the Catholic Church, we think of that particular crime and that the church is guilty of that crime, rather than that being a failure of an individual to uphold the teachings of the Catholic Church. And being able to make those kinds of distinctions was a significant barrier for me to overcome on my way to warming up to the idea of the truth of the Catholic faith. And I think that, there's an analogy here that might be helpful. So let's say someone was doing a scientific inquiry to examine some causes and effects. Like, let's say there was a particular community in which there was an abnormal and inflated amount of people who were suffering from some sort of a skin disease, right? And they wanted to figure out what is the cause of that effect. And they could look at a whole number of variables that correlate to that cause, but aren't necessarily the cause itself. Like you could say, oh, this is a cold climate. They have a unique water treatment facility here that practices water treatment in a way that is distinct from other places. And there's a lot of industry here, so maybe there's a certain type of air pollution here that you wouldn't find in other places. Now you could easily jump to the conclusion and say, that's why there's this skin disease that is really common here. But that's only a correlation and not necessarily a causation or a link to the causation. And what you would have to do is operate under a process of elimination to kind of isolate those correlations to figure out what is the actual cause. So what if you were able to take a subset of the people of that community who suffer from this skin irritation or the skin disease and give them only bottled water for a certain amount of time? So you isolate that one variable and you eliminate it from the range of variables that could be contributing to this particular phenomenon. And then you discover that the skin irritation persists even though you've removed that variable. Well, now you know that was only a correlation and that the water treatment had nothing to do, that there must be something else that is to blame for this particular phenomenon. Well, from all the things that we could accuse the Catholic Church of, such as corruption and scandal and abuse and war and violence and injustice, those things might feature prominently in the history of the Catholic Church, especially when the Catholic Church was itself a prominent influencer within society, especially public society and public policy and politics. But then eventually the Catholic Church went into decline and was marginalized and was pushed out of that realm of society, such that religion became something more like a personal preference, especially in liberal democracies. And when that happens, when the ingredient of the Catholic Church and its influence is removed from society and the influence of society in that way, do we find then that things like scandal, corruption, abuse, war, and violence disappear? And the answer to that question is no, we don't. So to blame that upon the creed of the Catholic faith is inaccurate. At best, you have a correlation, but certainly not a cause for why these things occur. And there must be some other common denominator that exists throughout human civilization that is distinct from the Catholic creed. So once I was able to appreciate that kind of distinction, the distinction between the kinds of horrible things that have been done by Catholics and even groups of Catholics and the creed itself, it became merely an inquiry about whether or not the creed was true in my mind. And as I looked into it, and I have other videos about this that spend more time obviously talking about this, I became convinced that there was a lot of credibility to this creed, if not merely that it was true. And so when I eventually became Catholic, I did so fully convinced that these two things were true. One, that the Catholic creed was true, and B, that Catholics who are members of the church have committed horrible transgressions throughout its history. And once I became Catholic, I started to immerse myself in the church's teachings, especially its history of teachings, to figure out what are the consistent threads of belief such that I can adopt them and apply them in my own life. And as I did so, I learned a lot about the church's history. And one thing that shocked me at every phase of my inquiry was the fact that many of the things I had been led to believe, many of the prejudices that I had adopted myself, either through formal education or just because of popular sentiment and narrative, about the Catholic Church were simply not true. They were at best fairly egregious and slanderous exaggerations, and at worst, complete fabrications. When you think of things like the Crusades and the Spanish Inquisition and the persecution of Galileo, I had all kinds of ideas and things that I had been taught about these events that I was convinced were true, only to discover that through what I considered fairly objective inquiry on my part, if you were to accuse me of prejudice at all, it would be that the popular narrative was true, that slanders and condemns the Catholic Church. I had to have those prejudices unraveled through my objective inquiry. For example, I had been taught that the Crusades were part of this long pattern of Christian European expansionist imperialism that we're all familiar with, in which European powers went and attacked otherwise peaceful neighboring nations who didn't believe the same things as them. As I learned about the Crusades, I discovered that the Crusades were actually, as a matter of fact, and I have a whole video about this, a defensive war. That it was a response to 400 years of Islamic aggression and expansion against Christian communities and territories. And by the time the Crusades had been called, again, this had been 400 years of aggression, 2/3 of the Christian world had already been conquered by Islamists and Islamic warlords. And just to get a sense of the contrast of aggressive conflicts, the Christian nations, or Christendom, can be accused of about 15 aggressive conflicts, whereas there were over 500 aggressive conflicts by their Muslim rivals. These are the kinds of things that I was taught formally in an education setting, while simultaneously being taught that things like the French Revolution were, on the whole, a good thing, that it ushered in an age of freedom and equality and fraternity and liberalism, while things like the Spanish Inquisition could be characterized by their tyranny and their bloodlust. But just in examining those two events of history, so let's look at the Spanish Inquisition really quickly here, or just even the Inquisition in general. I was taught and led to believe that the Inquisition was something like the Holocaust of the 20th century, that this was an unjust persecution against minorities by powerful Christians, and it led to the execution, the burnings, and the beheadings and the tortures of countless, maybe even millions of people. When in fact, over the course of 3 centuries, some of the highest estimates are about 5,000 executions, and that the Spanish Inquisition was only set up and only had authority over those who were confirmed Catholics. It wasn't set up to persecute Jews or Muslims, as is popularly believed. And that isn't to say that Jews and Muslims didn't suffer under persecutions in places like Spain in the 12th and 13th centuries, but those persecutions were policies of the state, not necessarily of even the church itself, institutionally, let alone the community of believers. By contrast, the French Revolution, which is the first moment in which a nation like France, which would have been a pillar of the heart of Christendom in Europe, suddenly the church and her influence in Catholic monarchies are set aside for a movement that is inspired by modern ideals of secularism and liberalism and freedom and equality. And over the course of a period of about 4 years, some 17,000 people are executed in this first outburst of Enlightenment ideology, and another 10,000 die within prison, not to mention all the violence and chaos and warfare that erupted as a direct result of the French Revolution. So given these kinds of comparisons and these kinds of events, why would we condemn the Catholic Church for something like the Spanish Inquisition or the Crusade and give a pass to our modern beliefs about liberalism and freedom and socialism when those kinds of crimes and transgressions have been committed in its name? The truth is that if you were to compare the history in which the Church was most prominent in European and Western civilization, so let's say the Middle Ages, to the history in which the church was pushed aside for secularism and secular authorities in the modern age, especially the 19th and 20th centuries, the truth is that war, injustice, genocide, starvation due to poor economic and philosophical policies take place in the 20th century on a scale that is completely unheard of and unrivaled during the ages of Christendom. And yet we who still embrace these ideas of the modern world and of modernism look at the Catholic Church and look at the eras of Christendom with contempt and condemnation while turning a blind eye to our own massive failures that far eclipse anything that we could accuse the medieval world of. And these kinds of fabrications and exaggerations sadly persist to this day. Just this morning I read an article about about a delegation of indigenous people who are meeting at the Vatican and with the Pope today to get an apology for the crimes of what many people know of as the Indian residential school system, which took place over the course of over 100 years in Canadian history, which was a boarding school system set up specifically for indigenous people, but also people of other ethnicities and other backgrounds attended these boarding schools as well. But a lot of abuse occurred, lots of deaths occurred from diseases like tuberculosis, and so now there's a bit of a reckoning around that. But this delegation that has gone to the Vatican and gained an audience with the Pope is more recently because of the discovery of over 200 graves of children previously unmarked and often characterized as a mass grave at a residential school in Kamloops, BC. And when that discovery was made, the press release was something to the effect of 215 children, previously unmarked graves, some as young as 3 years old. And how do they know this? Well, they made this discovery because they use ground-penetrating radar, which detects soil disturbances. Now, we all have this idea because we have this unfailing blind trust in science and technology that someone went and x-rayed the ground and found all kinds of bodies and skeletons lying there. How else could you confirm that a 3-year-old would be buried in this location? By the way, this was in an apple orchard, a place where trees were planted, vegetation was harvested. So the kind of place where soil disturbances might be kind of a common thing. But anyways, they use this ground penetrating radar, and all it shows is places where soil has been disturbed. It doesn't show bodies. It doesn't show you the kind of thing where you can confirm that a 3-year-old might be laying there. And not a single body has since been excavated. No bodies have been discovered there. Just the fact that these soil disturbances exist was enough for this press release and for the mainstream media here in Canada, as well as internationally, to carry this story of mass graves and mass murder committed by the Catholic Church in these residential schools, and specifically in this church, this school in Kamloops. And it was because of those headlines that now there are renewed commitments for millions of dollars of payouts and audiences with the Pope, who has now since apologized. I also noticed another article that accompanied this one by the same. So the one I was reading was from CTV News. Another was by CBC News, who are some of the big players in Canadian mainstream media. CBC News, the headline that I read was something to the effect of, "The Vatican sits upon billions of dollars of assets, and it's time they put their money where their mouth is," which is the natural progression of what happens after the apology. It's not an acceptance of that apology and an acceptance and forgiveness. It's, okay, now the payouts should start. And that's not me denying that abuses and things like that occurred within the Indian residential school system, but it is to say that that is a small subset and a small institution that needs to be distinguished from what we call the Catholic Church, which is, again, this creed of association that all Catholics throughout the world subscribe to. The Pope wasn't involved in any of the administration or the construction or the design of the system that we now know as Indian residential schools. And yet, because of the association of that creed, and the failure of some to uphold that creed, there's nothing in the creed that says that, you should abuse children. So because of that correlation, the Pope is now being asked for a personal apology, and the Vatican, that is the Diocese of Rome, is expected to offer a massive payout based on the curation of its assets in things like museums and stuff like that. So why is it that we have these glaring double standards when it comes to the Catholic Church, and we are unwilling to apply these same standards to modern ideals and modern states and modern belief systems? I would say in large part because, as we all know, victors write the history books. And in the struggle over the identity and the heart and the influence of Europe, it was the secular authorities who won out and then marginalized the Catholic Church and wrote those history books for us, especially the British Empire, who became the most dominant empire in the world. And it was the post-Reformation British Empire who fabricated a lot of these legends that we now know of. Think of the Spanish Black Legend. If you've never heard of that, look it up. Take some time to research this and discover that much of what we believe about the Spanish Inquisition, about Catholic Spain itself, were complete propaganda fabrications by the British Empire, who was its Protestant rival. And why did Great Britain become Protestant in contrast to its formerly Catholic identity? Because one of its all-powerful kings wanted to divorce his wife and continue to have as many wives as he felt necessary until he could produce an heir and satisfy his urges. And we now admit that. We now admit the sort of egregious history that informs that shift. Yet at no point does anybody suggest that, well, then they should have gone back to the Catholic Church. We've just carried on with this whole movement away and embrace of whatever came next. I think there's another question that might erupt out of this conversation, which is, why are so many Catholics unable to uphold their beliefs? Well, for one, the creed itself says that we should expect that we are fallen in nature, that we are incapable to some degree of being good until we are transformed through the process of this life and embracing and being reconciled to God. That is what will lead us towards becoming good. But in the meantime, we are going to fall short of the standard of goodness that we are aiming at. But furthermore, there are a lot of Catholics, and even just Christians in general in a variety of church traditions, who don't believe the teachings of their church, but still insist on being a member of these communities. And there's a lot of reasons for that. One I could identify is that there is a phenomenon within the church in which certain kinds of people who you could characterize as being very difficult, who cause a lot of conflict wherever it is that they go, and who struggle to find acceptance as a result of their personalities, of their temperaments, or their behavior in any other aspect of society. But the church is committed to forgiveness and acceptance of people regardless. And it is for that reason that people like this often find acceptance and community and affiliation within the church where they can't find it anywhere else. And it is people like this that you can understand often don't really believe the teachings of the church, but subscribe to that affiliation for different reasons. And believe it or not, it is a lot of these kinds of people who also find employment within the church, because where they wouldn't be able to find sustained employment elsewhere, again, because of their temperament and their behavior, it is the church who is much more reluctant to fire people for their failures. And so they persist in roles like this. I, in the short time that I've been a Catholic, relatively speaking, have met a lot of these kinds of people. They are a prominent element within the professional realm of the Catholic Church. And also, the Catholic Church is the largest religion in the world. Imagine if everybody became Catholic. Would that then suddenly mean that all of the kinds of egregious things that are synonymous with human nature would suddenly disappear? Of course not. Those things would persist. They might decline to some degree because of the adherence to the doctrines which say you should love your neighbor as yourself and care for those in need. But those things would still persist because of the failures to uphold that creed and those doctrines and those beliefs. But just because that kind of behavior and those failures would persist doesn't mean that the Catholic Church, even though everybody in that scenario would be described as Catholic, is to blame for those failures. So in spite of these double standards and in spite of the kinds of slander that I often get associated with, I publicly identify as Catholic and publicly defend the Catholic faith. And so that might raise another question. Why would I do that knowing that that's not going to win me any popularity contests? And I would say the reason for that is as much as I would prefer to be liked by people, it's more important to me that I can apply a creed that is true to my life in the service of what betters my own ability to function in society and as a person. And of course, the metaphysical and the spiritual aspects of all of this, which are that I hope to gain eternal life in the end. So it's more important to me to uphold what is true and at all costs, no matter if I will face any sort of persecution or public condemnation or even material costs as a consequence of that. If I might lose my job or work that might come into my business as a result of that. I think that kind of integrity is important and also very much lacking in society today. We saw this in a very dramatic way in this whole Will Smith episode that happened at the Oscars. He went up and did something that I think the general reaction to it was, that was wrong. And people were shocked by it. You could see sort of the awkward reaction within the audience. And yet, they gave him a standing ovation minutes later when he won an Oscar. Not willing to impose their moral beliefs upon that scenario or uphold their true moral beliefs or the things that they believe to be true. Instead, waiting to take the temperature of the room and waiting to see what the general reaction was going to be, if it was leaning more towards approving what he did or towards condemning what he did. And we're seeing it shift more towards the latter. And as a result, many people are now coming out and saying, oh yeah, that was wrong. He shouldn't have done that. Yet many of those same people were probably among the celebrities and movie stars and producers and directors who gave him a standing ovation when he went to go accept his award. So there's a significant lack of integrity in our morally relativistic world that we live in now. And it's very rare for somebody to say, here's what I believe, and I will uphold that even when it costs me something. That is the virtue of fortitude. And it is classically known as one of the cardinal virtues that all other virtues ripple out and proceed from. And it is one that I recognize as being a good that I need to adopt, a good disposition, a good habit that should characterize who I am and what I'm about. And And so I aim towards fortitude, and I aim to uphold this creed and these things that I have privately and now publicly adopted and confessed. And as I alluded to at the beginning of this commentary, it's not uncommon for me to re-examine these things I believe, not because I'm embarrassed by them, although I am embarrassed by them, or I'm at least embarrassed by the behavior of many Catholics at times, but because there are things that occur that could be used to accuse the creed of being false. And there are times where I will re-examine, why is it that I am Catholic? Why do I subscribe to these beliefs, and why do I apply them to my life? And so far, every time I've done that, I've come out with the same conclusions, that the creed is true, and I will continue to apply it to my life accordingly. So I hope that answers that question in some detail. I know that was a bit clumsy. It was unscripted. Most of the time I try to script these videos to some degree, but because of the length and the amount of depth that needed to be covered for something like this, I didn't do that here. So I apologize for how seemingly incoherent and all over the place that might have been, but that was my best attempt to answer that question. Thanks for watching. The reason I can continue making content like this is because of the generous support of my viewers. If you feel called to support this work, then consider joining the Reinforcements, which is my online community. There are multiple tiers, including free access for those who can't help financially but still want to join. You can join up at www.brianholdsworth.ca. Certain levels will also get a free gift basket from Glory and Shine, who is a family-owned Catholic bath and body products company whose beard balm I'm wearing right now. It's like aromatherapy for your face. Even if you don't join, they make amazing products, so check them out at gloryandshine.com. And don't forget to like and subscribe. You don't have to agree with everything I said to get value out of these kinds of conversations, so be sure to subscribe to be edified or challenged. There's value in both.
Pray, brethren, that my sacrifice and yours may be acceptable to God the Almighty Father. May the Lord accept the sacrifice